Wide receiver Chris Olave is one of the New Orleans Saints' most tradable assets, but that doesn't mean that they should just pull the trigger. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're talking Tuesday trades. I'll tell you why Alvin Kamara won't be traded. We'll take a look at Pete Werner and some other tradable assets that the New Orleans Saints have sort of in the second tier of their movable items. And we're going to take a look at the players that might be the most movable, including wide receiver Chris Olave, but highlight why the New Orleans Saints shouldn't be in a hurry to just unabashedly undergo a fire sale. We got all that coming up for you on today's episode. We appreciate you very much, whether it's your first time or your next time, being here with us this time, making us your first listen, and being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5 as their first bet. And if that first $5 bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. Head over to FanDuel.com today to get started. New Orleans Saints wide receiver Chris Olave is probably the team's most tradable asset, but it doesn't mean that they should be shopping him all around the NFL. Here's what I want to do for today's episode. I'm going to just peel back the curtain a little bit. I want to have a conversation about why the New Orleans Saints could be sellers at the trade deadline, but not necessarily actively be looking to market their players, right? You could be a seller, but are you putting in the money for the marketing? Maybe not. I think that's kind of where the Saints might be. And so what I want to do is I want to have this conversation in earnest. What makes a tradable asset? And who are the tradable assets? And we'll go from most tradable, and then we'll take a look at some other kind of second tier tradable type players. But I want to make sure that we're having this conversation in a not like clickbaity, oh, the Saints can trade Chris Olave to the Philadelphia Eagles for AJ Brown straight up. Who says no? Like, I don't want to do that kind of stuff because first of all, I'm not good at it, right? Secondly, like a big part of this show is all about making it better to be a Saints fan every day. That's one of my biggest goals. One of my other biggest goals is to kind of make the NFL game and business around the NFL a little bit less enigmatic each day as well. So I want to really, really dive into this. And so to do that, let's start off first with what it is that makes Chris Olave and some other players around him tradable. And we're going to use air quotes when we say tradable, because I want to be really clear that a tradable player is not the same thing as a quote player that should be traded. Player that should be traded is something that sounds like a punishment, which is not the way that trades are often pursued or done. Certainly you can think of examples of those kind of disciplinary trades almost, but really for the most part, that's not why trades are made. So let's take a look at what's a tradable asset, who those players are, and why you might look to trade those players if the right offer comes along. What is a tradable player? What makes a player tradable? Well, I've got 5 things that to me make a player tradable. First of all, they have to be talented. They have to be a talented and good enough player. You can't be a bad player and get traded for something meaningful. If you're a team like the New Orleans Saints who could use future assets in terms of building their team further in their new vision, under their new direction, and undergoing and undertaking their new era, if you want meaningful assets back, you don't get to trade bad or unwanted players. So talented is number 1. Number 2 is a player that brings value. So not just talented, but can bring value to a certain system, who maybe has worked with a certain coach before, who maybe brings something different to that team, right? You can have a talented player, but trying to trade that player to a team that has 5 of that same player already under different names, you're probably not going to have a good time moving that player. You're probably not going to move that player for very much. So I think bringing value, unique value, let's say, is another thing. Filling a void, right? Sometimes you have an injury or a need that's created that's not really about the roster, but something that is consequential of something else, right? The consequence of something else. So you're trying to fill a void. Number 4, maybe you have a player, you have to have a player with an acceptable contract. You're not trading a $100 million wide receiver in their first year of their contract extension, but trading a player that's about to go into their 5th-year option, a very agreeable and easy to manage situation, while also giving the new team avenues to either make the decision to or not to extend that player. You're giving somebody a lot of runway with that player. And then finally, availability. And that availability is defined in 2 different ways: health, available and on the field. Although, again, that's not a universal answer. We saw the New Orleans Saints trade for Jalen Polk, who is actively not available, but he brings value. He could fill a void in the future, blah, 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 right? And is a talented player. So I'm not saying that these are 100% all cases in trades, but just these are the typical qualities. And in the second half of that being available part is being available for trade, right? Are there untouchables on a roster? And I don't think that the Saints have a lot of untouchables. We'll get to that as we look at sort of those second tier tradable players. Now, what's not tradable? An injury-prone player or a player that's actively injured. Again, obviously examples. We've seen them here in New Orleans before, and we just saw it here in New Orleans not too long ago. But generally speaking, teams don't trade for injured players. But they will trade for players with an injury history that are healthy, right? So that's a different thing. Number 2, you don't trade players that you're mad at. That's not how the NFL works. Oh, this player, dropped these passes, they should trade him. This player fumbled the football, they should trade him. This player can't do this, that, and the other. They're not hitting the field. They haven't learned the playbook, blah, blah. They should trade him. That is Madden team building. That's not the reality of team building in the NFL. If a player is not doing well on your team, very few teams are going to look at that player and go, you know what? I bet they do well on my team. I'll give up valuable assets for them. Not going to happen. Maybe they go to free agency 2 years later and then that team brings them in, but typically not undergoing the trade in that situation. Struggling and downright bad players are players that aren't going to get traded. I'll take you back to the Isaiah Foskey and Peyton Turner. Oh, they're not getting on the field. They're not doing well. The Saints need to trade them. That's not a tradable player. Struggling players and downright bad players are not tradable players. So who are some of the tradable assets for the New Orleans Saints? Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, Alvin Kamara, heavy asterisk there. We'll get to that a little bit later on in the show. Carl Granderson, Alontae Taylor. Those are 5 players, not the only 5, but those are 5 players that I think check most of the 5 boxes that I just highlighted. Talented, bringing value, filling voids, have agreeable contracts, and are available in terms of health. The reason why I don't think that the Saints should be in a hurry to trade any of these players is because they're not going to be a team that's actively looking to sell. However, they can pick up a phone if somebody else calls. So I think there's a big difference between when a player is being made available by a seller versus a team that's willing to sell based on who picks up the phone, based on who calls them, based on what the offer is on the other side. Speaking of the other side, as we continue this conversation, what I want to go into next is the difference between a tradable player as well as a player that should be traded. We'll re-highlight that. We'll go further into why the players I just named aren't players that the Saints should actively be looking to sell, and look at some of the other players that could potentially be available. Let's keep this conversation going here as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at Built Rewards. Nobody likes paying rent, but if you got to do it, you might as well get something for it. That is where Built comes in. Built is changing the game by turning your rent payments into real rewards that you can actually use. So maybe you want to take your rent from being something that is working against you, it can feel like sometimes, and instead turn it into something that's working for you, earning points that you can use every month on something that you already have to pay for anyway. Everything from travel to getting some stuff to use at your favorite local restaurant, maybe heading to the gym as well. Like there's a ton here that you can get over with Built Rewards. So I highly suggest that you check it out today. Turn your rent into rewards and start earning points around your neighborhood by going to joinbuilt.com/LockedOnNFL. That's JOINBILT swirling.com/LockedOnNFL and make sure you use that link so that they know that we sent you. Today's episode of Locked On Saints also brought to you by friends over at Rougiette. We're talking about pure confidence when it comes to Rougiette. So if you're looking for something that goes beyond the usual pill, it's time to try Rougiette Go Long. Rougiette Go Long is not just another ED pill, it's a total game changer for confidence. Effects can last up to 36 hours. That's confidence all day, all night, and even into the next day. It combines two doctor-trusted medications with one dual action formula so that you can, play hard and go the distance. So get ready to level up your confidence in the bedroom. Head to rugiet.com and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL for 15% off of your first order. That's rugiet.com/LockedOnNFL. Make sure you use that link so that they know that we sent you. That's Rougiette, rugiet.com/LockedOnNFL. All right, family. The New Orleans Saints do have tradable assets, but it doesn't mean that they need to be in a hurry to be picking up the phone and letting everybody in the NFL know that those players are available. So we highlighted what it is that makes a player tradable. We talked about why Chris Olave might be the team's most tradable asset. Very young, has a ton of talent, would fill a lot of voids around the NFL. There's some injuries at the wide receiver position all across the league as well. You think about the Giants, you think about the Dolphins, so on and so forth. And then, you look at the contract, right? Like we mentioned, fifth-year option, going into his fifth-year option, gives the team a lot of control in terms of knowing what the expenditure is for 2026, getting a prorated contract here in 2025. That was almost a full word. Prorated contract here in 2025, my apologies, but then also have the ability to be able to negotiate a contract after another year and a half of performance, should they want to, as opposed to, a trade that requires you to extend that player upon acquiring them. We see that in some cases when it comes to trade. Certainly happened with Micah Parsons, right? Micah Parsons got traded and got a deal. Or was that true? Was that Micah Parsons? Well, it was somebody. Somebody got traded and then also got a deal. I'm pretty sure it was Parsons, but I could be wrong there. But so anyway, you don't have to deal with that right away. You can see how that player fits in your system and how they work with your quarterback and how they're a part of your scheme, and then make the decision to extend after getting some eyes-on, hands-on evaluation when it comes to that player. But just because the player is tradable doesn't mean that the player should be traded. And that's where I wanted to draw the line here. Trades are not about punishments. Yes, you can think of a couple. I know I certainly can. CJ Gardner-Johnson, sometimes, that was one that I thought of before, to where like that kind of felt like, hey, you know what? You want safety money. The team wants to pay you slot corner money. This isn't going to work, trading you somewhere else. That you could look at and say, okay, that was a punishment. But I don't think that that's really what that was. But I do think that was about money. That was about contract. That was about all those other things. So the three reasons why trades mostly get made. Number one, the return that you're getting is perceived as the correct value for the player that you're losing, right? So there's two. Now I'm thinking about players in trades, not pick for pick trades. Obviously, that's going to be a little bit different. You're looking at trade value charts, all those other things. There's other models for that. But when it comes to trading a player, it's about what is your value for that player, and is the team going to send you something that feels of value and feels like it's going to work? Marshawn Lattimore was a good example of that last year, right? The Saints weren't necessarily actively shopping Marshawn Lattimore, but that's a player that got them a good return. And the Saints made that decision. And so far, I'll be honest, it feels like the Saints made the right decision in terms of making that move, as tough as it was at that time. So you're looking at, is the return worth the player that I'm losing? If the answer is yes, that player is then tradable, right? There is a price for that player. You're trying to get better. And that sometimes is a player for player situation, or you're trading your picks to get that player. You're trying to make yourself better. A good example of this was the preseason trade when the Saints sent Colin Saunders, defensive tackle, to the Jacksonville Jaguars, a position that the Saints had really a lot of talent, still have a lot of talent. And in return, they got center depth, offensive line depth in Luke Fortner, somebody that's still on their roster, something that the Saints needed. Colin Saunders, still on the Jaguars roster. You're trying to get better in those situations. And then finally, lastly, money/opportunity, right? Money meaning I don't want to pay you the money that you want, so let me trade you to somebody that will. That happens. Other times it's opportunity, right? Jalen Polk's a really good example of opportunity. Hey, there's a new regime in New England again, and maybe Jalen Polk doesn't necessarily fit in with that team's vision. So trade him to a place where he can sit for a year, get through injured reserve, and then have a role once he's healthy, or have a better chance at a role once he's healthy. All of that makes sense. So when it comes to the value that you're looking for, a lot of times you're trying to base the value that you can get on a player for what you might potentially get from them in terms of a comp selection, the compensatory selection, if they were to walk in free agency and get a larger contract. The best comp pick that you can get is a late round 3 selection, which means a lot of times when we're talking about these players like Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, Alvin Kamara, Carl Granderson, Alontae Taylor, the absolute bottom and sometimes even still unacceptable return that you want from that player would be at least a 3rd round pick. A lot of times for most of these players, especially the ones that I named, you probably want better than that. A little bit tougher with running back, but that's not going to be an issue for New Orleans. Then you have other tradable pieces. Pete Werner has heard his name, I'm sure, pop up a ton in trade conversations amongst the fan base. Pete Werner has been a lot of those. Tight end Juwan Johnson recently has been a lot of those, but he's an example of a player that you can't just trade because he makes you mad. Cesar Ruiz, same thing. Can't trade him just because he makes you mad, but is one of those kind of second tier, not as agreeable a tradable contract, which kind of knocks it down a little bit. And then Dylan Radins, who actually is a pretty good depth piece on your roster, maybe could be a starter somewhere else, but you'd have to find the team that would give you the starter return value for that player in order for that trade to really make sense. So that's what kind of makes that second tier, because the gap between what that player is versus what they would need that player to be versus what the Saints would want in return for that player, all a little bit disjointed in a way. Now, could any of the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 players that I just named be traded before the November 4th trade deadline? 100% yes. I think the only players that you can really look at as being untouchable for the New Orleans Saints are the 2025 draft class, Alvin Kamara, I'll tell you why in a moment, and maybe, it would be strange to see the Saints just like up and trade Spencer Rattler away. That wouldn't make a lot of sense to me. So that would be maybe another one that I would kind of put in there. But truly, you could find a caveat for that, right? Because the right price comes, then maybe you still end up making that decision. I don't know. But 2025 draft class, as well as Alvin Kamara, are really kind of like the solid ones where you go like, okay, those are probably the untouchable players. Otherwise, players are untouchable because they don't check one of those boxes. They're not talented enough to bring a big return. They don't necessarily provide the value to a team that they might be looking for. They don't necessarily fill a void because there's not a lot of injuries at that position or something like that. They don't have a tradable contract, or they're not available in one way or another. And so sometimes players don't check those boxes, and that's fine. None of that is a bad thing. And so with all that considered, what you're probably looking at for the players that we discussed, Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, Alvin Kamara, Carl Granderson, Alontae Taylor, in terms of the top, you're probably looking day 1, day 2 asking price, right? Round 1, round 2, or round 3 picks. Whereas these other players, Pete Werner, Juwan Johnson, Cesar Ruiz, Dylan Radins, considering the guys that are actually tradable, Pete Werner and maybe Dylan Radins, you're probably looking at like day 3 kinds of selections. That's pretty much where the gap is, right? And some of that is informed by what the comp pick would be if they left and got a big contract somewhere. So it's really about contract value and trying to project that more than it is about the player. But the bottom line here is that if you're going to trade a player, you're typically not doing it because you're tired of that player or because you want to trade that player. Typically speaking, you're trading a player because you really like the return that you can get for that player. That means trading players that you like is the most effective way to get something back in return that you will like. Imagine that. And so that's what makes these conversations so tough, and why I wanted to have a detailed conversation in earnest about it, because it's not about advocating for a player to be traded. It's not about advocating for the Saints to go out there and sell. It's not about saying that the Saints should trade this player or that player. It's about whether or not the Saints will get the return, or any NFL team would get the return for that player that makes a trade make sense. And unless that happens, I don't expect anybody to be on the move. That doesn't mean that I don't expect anybody to be on the move, but if they are, it's because of what the teams offered the New Orleans Saints more than it is about the New Orleans Saints saying, I want to trade this player. Insert name here. All right, coming up next, the New Orleans Saints very likely won't be trading away Alvin Kamara, and I'm going to tell you why as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, my favorite place to go to get in on the action for your favorite sports events. And of course, with that NFL season rolling along right now, FanDuel has an offer you do not want to miss. Right now, new customers can bet just $5 and get $300 back in bonus bets if that first $5 bet wins. That's right. Pick a bet, put down $5, and if you win, if that hits, you'll unlock $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. More money lines, more spreads, player props, same game parlays, live betting, which is one of my favorite things to do. Maybe you're feeling really good about the New Orleans Saints trying to bounce back off of their loss to the New England Patriots, going up against the Chicago Bears. Right now, 4.5-point underdogs on the road. Maybe you like the Bears in the money line there. Maybe you like the Saints in the money line there. You can get in on all that action and more over at FanDuel today. So what are you waiting for? Head over to FanDuel.com to download the FanDuel app and get started today. That's FanDuel.com. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. The New Orleans Saints could potentially look to move some players if the offers are right up ahead of that November 4th trade deadline. But one of the players that I would be shocked to see the Saints move on from is running back Alvin Kamara. And it's got just as much to do with what he wants as it has to do with what the organization wants as well. We spent today trying to have an earnest and honest conversation around what makes a tradable asset, what doesn't make a tradable asset, what the trades could look like, why you trade, all those other things. But there are players that you just simply decide not to trade and decide are kind of off limits as well. I expect the 2025 draft class to be that, right? You've got guys that are this coaching staff, this new coaching staff, it's their first draft class, all those other things. You're not trading away Jonas Sanker. Ain't nobody doing that. Ain't nobody trading away Kelvin Banks. Like, it's not happening. You know what I mean? And so, or at least I don't foresee that happening. But there's not just the draft class. There are those other players that are important to the identity of the team, the faces of the franchise, if you will, that maybe sometimes you make those concessions and say, you know what, not trading you. And one of those players not only is a player that I don't see the Saints trading, but is a player that doesn't want to be traded, is running back Alvin Kamara. Ian Rappaport over at NFL Network, great story on the Saints, getting some of those conversations, getting some of those phone calls about guys like, I'm sure, Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, Pete Werner, Carl Granderson, some of the same names we've talked about before. And it would not be surprising if the Saints also got phone calls about Alvin Kamara, teams like the Kansas City Chiefs, the Los Angeles Chargers, the teams that are close and in need of running back help. And instead of Mickey Loomis, New Orleans Saints general manager, just picking up the phone, hearing an offer that he liked, and then making the move, he treated the face of the franchise like the face of the franchise and went to him and said, hey, if this were to come to fruition, would you want to go? And Alvin Kamara apparently told Mickey Loomis the same thing that he has been telling local media for years. You can go back to last year's training camp in California. You can go back to the year before that when Cam Jordan got that big extension. And he expressed his desire over and over again to be a New Orleans Saint and having no desire to go anywhere else. I think at one point he even went so far as to say that he'd rather, if he's not playing for the New Orleans Saints, that he's sitting on his couch or something like that. I mean, he has been very open about this. And he turned around and apparently just kind of rehashed that to Mickey Loomis. And because of that, I don't expect that he's going anywhere. It'd be kind of surprising if he did. This is a New Orleans Saints team right now that can use players like Alvin Kamara, not just on the field, but also off the field in terms of keeping the organization keeping the locker room together, all that. And when you're a veteran that could have an opportunity to go somewhere else to win a Super Bowl or win a game, and you say, you know what, no, I like where I'm at, I want to be here. I think that speaks loudly to the roster. It kind of helps keep everybody bought in. I think that's a great thing. Now, listen, is Alvin Kamara saying, no, I don't want to go enough to force the New Orleans Saints not to trade him? Absolutely not. But could I see the New Orleans Saints returning the favor by not shipping him away? Yeah, sure. I could absolutely see that. And it would be a perfectly understandable and logical and reciprocal thing to do based on the fact that Alvin Kamara wants to stay here in New Orleans. The other thing that I think that this tells us is that despite the Saints not ever really being willing to go up and say, yes, the rebuild is on, because why would they? They shouldn't. I think that approaching one of your star players and saying, hey, would you like to go effectively, if you have the opportunity, would you like to go to a better situation? That's kind of what this conversation can be, right? Kansas City Chiefs are calling, Los Angeles Chargers are calling. They're, really good football teams, one of which was undefeated until very recently. Would you like to go there? That is something that a team that understands where it is in the hierarchy of the NFL, that's just showing a level of understanding that they know where they are. And I think that that's an important thing. One of the biggest criticisms that Mickey Loomis and the New Orleans Saints have gotten over the many, many years is that, oh, well, your successful age is done and you didn't turn the page fast enough. Well, the Saints aren't elongating that. They're not extending that. They're clearly in a situation here to where they understand where they are, who they are, and where they are within the NFL's hierarchy, the league's hierarchy. And they're operating as such, trading for guys that might not be available to them right now, but could have a big impact, trading for guys that have only 2 years down on their contract, going to players and saying, hey, would you like to be moved if the opportunity is there for you to a better team? Maybe you're not saying the better team part out loud, but you're acknowledging where you are. And I think that that's a good and wise thing for the New Orleans Saints. So I don't expect to see Alvin Kamara going anywhere. But if he does, it's mostly for an opportunity to get something back that would be kind of game-changing for New Orleans. But I don't know that the Saints will even go that route. All right, coming up in tomorrow's episode, we're going to start taking a look at the Chicago Bears and what lies ahead in the Dennis Allen revenge game that could potentially be on the way. We appreciate you very much, as always, making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me on the show. If you see me, please say hi. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Learn what the family's doing. Let me know how you living. Let me know how you momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation. I'll holla at you.